And the Championship, Chapter 11, entitled Thin Sliced, Deep Fried Tubers. So why isn't the magic working? Said Lily Matisse. How am I supposed to know? Said Leon. It's got to be the spit, said PW. Possibly, said Leon, clearly unconvinced. The three were sitting in the science lab, waiting for the start of class. Tests on Pumpkinhead 2.0, like his predecessor, had ended in disappointment, despite repeated trials during recess, lunch, and gym. You know what I think the problem is, said Leon. I think, can it, said Lily Matisse. Here comes Sparks. The science teacher strode into class, bright green high top slapping against the laboratory linoleum. He planted himself on a stool at the front of the room and, without fireworks or flaming sleeves, posed a two-part question. What is science, he asked, and where do we find it? Antoinette Breed raised her hand. In textbooks? Mr. Sparks made a face. No, 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 he replied emphatically. That's the last place one finds science. Before we do anything else, I want all of you to take down the following formula. He faced the blackboard and wrote, textbooks equals the enemy of science. He turned back to the class and said, you have a far better chance of finding science in that fish tank over there, on the bottom of my Converse All-Stars, or in the things you do after school. Mr. Sparks abruptly grabbed the inflated plastic python off the chemical cabinet and playfully bonked Antoinette Breed's desk. Forget about textbooks and name a passion. Horseback riding, Antoinette Breed said at once. Perfect, said Mr. Sparks. If you really want to understand horseback riding, Antoinette, you have to know about breeds and bloodlines. In other words, you should study the science of genetics. Mr. Sparks spun around with a python. Bonk! He clunked PW's desk. Okay, kiddo, out with it. Name a passion. Legos, PW exclaimed. Do you have the medieval castle set? Asked Mr. Sparks. How'd you know? Educated guess. Would it surprise you to learn that we could spend an entire week on the science of the Lego drawbridge? Force, gravity, counterweight, leverage, pulleys, gears. Awesome, said PW. Let's do it. A number of students moaned. Sorry, PW, Mr. Sparks said. Not everyone seems to share your passion for interlocking building bricks. Bonk. The python landed on the desk of the new girl. Name a passion, Florence. Actually, Mr. Sparks, everybody calls me Flossie. Okay, Flossie, what do you love doing when you aren't stuck in school? I like to watch wrestling, she replied hesitantly. No kidding, said Mr. Sparks. Me too. Who's your favorite wrestler? Sergeant Slaughter, definitely. What do you think his best move is? The atomic noogie or the cobra clutch, said Flossie Parmigiano. Probably the clutch. Well, said Mr. Sparks, if you truly want to appreciate the beauty of the atomic noogie or the cobra clutch, or the Frankensteiner, the elbow smash, the scorpion deathlock, or the hip-hop drop, you've got to know about fulcrums and levers and about controlling the center of gravity. When Sergeant Slaughter performs that thing with his forearm, Mr. Sparks interrupted himself. What's the name of that move? The flying burrito? That's the one. When Sergeant Slaughter does a flying burrito, he's also giving his audience a lesson in basic mechanics. The fifth graders listened in stunned silence as Mr. Sparks pinned scientific principles to each of their after-school interests. He bonked Lily Matisse's desk. What rocks your boat? Gymnastics. What's your toughest move? Lily Matisse gave the question careful consideration. Probably a no-handed aerial cartwheel, she eventually said. What exactly is a no-handed aerial cartwheel? Asked Mr. Sparks. Without missing a beat, Lily Matisse stood up, took 2 steps, and hurtled herself forward, arms overhead, and without touching her hands to the ground, kicked her legs, the back one and then the front, over her body, and twisted around, nailing a perfect landing that she rounded off with a short, precise upturn of the head. "Wow!" exclaimed Mr. Sparks over the cheers of the class. "That's the whole package. Torque, trajectory, momentum, inertia, gravity. We could spend a month, maybe more, studying the physics of the no-handed aerial cartwheel." "No way," shouted PW. "Legos." "Gymnastics," Lily Matisse shot back. "Horseback riding," Antoinette advocated. "Wrestling," proposed Flossie Parmigiano. "Okay, guys, settle down," said Mr. Sparks. Bonk. The python head came down on the desk of the next unsuspecting student. Any idea who it was?
Leon.
Your turn, kiddo. What are you crazy about? Leon had had plenty of time to think about the question, and he was ready with an answer he felt sure would stump Mr. Sparks. "Potato chips," he said. And for a moment, no one in the class said a word. Then, all at once, the lab was rocked by explosions of laughter and applause, even louder than the one triggered by the no-handed aerial cartwheel. PW started a chant. "Chips, chips, chips, chips." His classmates soon joined in. Mr. Sparks allowed the cheer to run its course. When the room quieted down, he said, "Observational analysis suggests widespread support for thin-sliced, deep-fried tubers. Is that a valid hypothesis?" "Yes!" the whole class shouted. "So no one is anti-potato chip?"
No!
Flossie Parmigiano raised her hand. "Mr. Sparks, I love chips and all, but I'm not allowed to eat them at home." "Well, we're not at home, are we, Flossie?" "We sure aren't," Flossie Parmigiano said appreciatively. And for a long moment, Mr. Sparks stood silent, rocking back and forth on the heels of his high tops. It was obvious to everyone that ideas were pinwheeling inside his head. "Suppose," he said eventually, "we were to do a unit on potato chips." "A whole unit?" Thomas Warchowski blurted out excitedly. "No way." "Perhaps you're right," said Mr. Sparks. "The idea is outrageous. It is absurd to think we could study potato chips for 4 weeks. Forget I even brought it up." Moans of discontent spread through the lab. "Thanks a bunch, Warchowski," Lumpkin snarled menacingly. "There's no need for disappointment," said Mr. Sparks. "Perhaps I failed to make myself clear. I only meant that the subject is much too complex. Potato chips deserve, no, I take that back. They demand an entire year of study." Once more, the class started laughing. "I'm quite serious," said Mr. Sparks. "How would all of you feel if we spent the next 9 months investigating the science of potato chips?" "Potato chips and nothing but potato chips?" said PW. "That's the idea," said Mr. Sparks. "Count me in," said Leon. "Me too," said Thomas Warchowski. "Me 3," said Lily Matisse. Very quickly, everyone in the class had expressed support for the potato chip proposal. "Fine," said Mr. Sparks. "It's settled. I want all of you to raise your right hands and repeat after me." "What about lefties?" said Leon. "Lefties still raise their right hands," Mr. Sparks clarified. "Everyone ready to pledge allegiance to the bag?" 18 right hands went up, palm out. Now repeat after me, said Mr. Sparks. I agree. To study chips. The whole universe of chips. And nothing but chips. For the next 9 months. Okay then, said Mr. Sparks, the potato chip pact has been sealed with a pledge. Your first homework assignment is to bring in a favorite bag of research material. And so began the year of the chip.